Hey everyone, it's Scott from certmedia.com. Today I'm going to be showing you how to install, set up, and configure the WP Supercache plugin. To start, we're just going to go to the plugins menu, select add new, then you're just going to type in WP Super. You can type out the full name if you wish. You're going to select the first option that appears, WP Supercache by automatic. You're going to install and activate. So WP Supercache at its most basic level is just a simple page caching plugin. It does its job quite effectively. It's not as easy as Cache Enabler, which we did another video on, and it's not as fully fleshed out as W3 Total Cache, but it sits somewhere in the middle. If you really just need a basic page caching plugin, but you need some extra configurability, then this is a solid option. So to start, you go to your settings, you click WP Supercache, it'll take you to the menu. The first thing you'll have to do is set caching on, or else the plugin simply won't do anything. You'll click Update Status, and there's a cache tester button, and this will basically just warn you if you have a proxy enabled. So in this case, Cloudflare, you can go ahead and test it. It'll run its test, and in a moment it'll refresh, and it says timestamps on both pages were matched. What this means is that it fetched the page, it returned a cached page, and then the result came back with the correct timestamp. Now, we're going to go into the advanced options because simply enabling page caching isn't enough for most websites, especially with this plugin. So going into the advanced section, and if you've been using an older version of WP Supercache, the admin panel was cleaned up a little bit, but it's still lagging behind the competition. So there are two options. You'll first want to make sure that caching is enabled, and then there's cache delivery method. There's simple, and there's expert. And it just says expert caching requires changes to important server files and may require manual intervention. If you can go ahead and enable this for most situations. And then there's cache restrictions. Disable caching for logged in users. This is pretty much what you should have. You can disable caching for visitors who have a cookie set in their browser, but it depends on the cookie that you have. The best result is to just bypass the cache if someone's logged in. This is more in line with Cache Enabler, W3 Total Cache, and the like. You could set the don't cache pages with get parameters. A get parameter can be anything such as the search query. So on WordPress, if you go to your website and you do s equals and you type in 1, it'll take you to a search results page. It works exactly the same. You can tell it to not cache those pages. There's no real reason not to unless your site has a really active search engine and you don't need page caching for search pages. In which case, if you have this option enabled, your server may get flooded with a lot of basically cached pages, cached search results. So depending on the activity of your page, most people won't need to check this option. Really active site, you may need to check this option. Compress pages so they're served more quickly. This basically just pre-compresses the pages as gzip and then sends them that way. Sometimes if you have this option enabled, depending on your host, the front end will have a bunch of random characters and the site won't effectively load. And it's because the gzipped file is being gzipped a second time, in which case it mangles it during the decompression. So you should be able to use this option for most hosts. If you have the run-of-the-mill standard shared host, this option should work out of the box. If you have a little bit of a non-standard host, you may run into issues. The good news is if you do enable this option and the front end is broken, you can simply turn it off, clear the cache, and everything will work once again. The next option you'll want to make sure is on there is cache rebuild. Serve a super cache file to anonymous users while the new file is being generated. So what will happen is when WordPress Supercache is generating a new cached file for that page, maybe it's expired or it's pre-building the cache, it will continue to serve the cached file for the non-logged in users until that new file is being generated until it's been generated, and then it will delete the old now expired cached post. So I recommend having this option enabled. Cache HTTP headers with page content. This can go ahead and be enabled. Shouldn't really cause you any issues. 304 browser caching improves site performance by checking if the page has changed since the browser last requested it. This option can cause mixed issues. So 301 browser caching headers are really useful on extremely active but not frequently updated websites. So what will happen is when the visitor goes to your website, the server will send a 304 header that lets them know that, hey, this content, being the HTML, can be cached by the browser. The browser will then cache the entire HTML of your website. And then if the visitor, say, goes back to the home page, well, it'll already be served in cache, so it doesn't have to re-download the HTML and have to wait for the latency of your TTFB. So if your server responds in 300 milliseconds, it won't have to wait for that period because the cache has already been saved to the device. Now, what it's supposed to do is if the page has been updated, the server will send the header saying, hey, this page has been updated at this timestamp, and then the browser is going to check its cached version to make sure that the headers are aligned. If the headers are showing the older time period before it was updated, then it would clear the cache, download the new server, the new HTML served by your server, and then save that. Sometimes though, what happens is the browser may just not clear it, or the server may not be sending the headers correctly. So content will continue to be cached and they'll never get new content. This is particularly troubling if you have a news site and the HTML is cached. You'll have to really experiment with this option. If you can get it to work, serving this with enabling this option and serving the HTML to be cached on the browser level will save you your resources tremendously down the line. Then the only other option that you have is make known users anonymous so they're served super cache static files. Don't enable this option. Known users are logged in users. Now, under the advanced section, there's some more interesting stuff. Enable dynamic caching. And click this little FAQ, they'll take you over here, and let's see how they describe it. So dynamic caching, as you can see here, it'll make use of dynamic caching in most situations simply isn't needed. It's very similar to how W3 Total Cache does fragment caching. It's an option that unless you have a specific use case for, you won't enable. Almost all dynamic content on your front end is JavaScript now. Sometimes if you have view counter plugin, it may use PHP, in which case you would have to go dynamic caching and try to exclude it and a bunch of other. It's just not worth it. The next option is mobile device support. What this will do is you don't need to enable this option. What it will do instead, and if you go to the FAQ, it'll tell you, let's see, when you actually click, it doesn't tell you it. I serve cached pages on small screens. Like your theme is probably responsive, which means what this is trying to tell you is if your site's responsive and you're not using a plugin to make the site a mobile site, you can go ahead and leave this option unchecked. If you're using a plugin, you have to check this option. What WordPress Super Cache will attempt to do is generate a unique cache file for mobile user agents. That way, if you're using a mobile theme plugin, this will continue to work and the pages can be cached. If you're simply just using a responsive theme like most websites and most sites should be, then don't bother checking this option. Remove the UTF-8 blog char set support from htaccess file. Shouldn't need to check this option unless your server has a really odd configuration. Almost everybody uses UTF-8 now by anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Clear all cache files when a post or page is published or updated. I don't recommend doing this. I do recommend enabling the following option of extra homepage checks. If your homepage shows your blog post or really anything that gets updated on a daily basis, maybe you have an events calendar or something on your homepage that gets updated by you adding posts to your website, you'll want to have this option checked. You don't want to purge the entire cache whenever a new post or page is published, especially if you're a news website. That'll just consume an excess amount of server resources that simply don't matter. It doesn't matter. Only refresh the current page when comment is made. You can go ahead and enable this option. It's a fine option. Or you could leave it disabled. It's not a... What this should say, and how I'm thinking it's trying to interpret it as, with caching plugins, what they'll do is they will cache the page ahead of time. When a new comment is submitted, and if you have auto accept for comments on, or something similar, like if they've commented 3 times, their comments are automatically accepted, the page cache plugin will attempt to purge the cache so that way the post will show the latest comment. The user who made the comments will bypass it because they're given a unique cookie, but every other user wouldn't see the comment. What this, I believe, is doing is basically just refreshing the cache for only the current page that the comment was made on and not all pages by doing a complete cache purge. I would enable this option, but it's not really descriptive and the FAQ doesn't really. List the newest cached pages on this page. Go ahead and enable this. It doesn't really matter. This is only a bookmarking thing to make sure that your cache is actually functioning. If the cache is not functioning, you'll be able to see that pages are not being generated. And you can enable this option if you feel like it's not working, but this should be disabled in most options. Force file locking. Don't use this option. Should just be removed. Late initialization. Display cached pages after WordPress has loaded. This is similar to this cache basic in W3 Total Cache. I don't recommend enabling this option at all. Unfortunately, when you're loading it after WordPress has loaded, you're adding a severe amount of latency. Late initialization should only be done if you're using a poorly coded plugin that needs to make modifications as WordPress is loading in, but before the page is cached. It's such a niche use case that the option should honestly not even exist in the plugin. But if you need that option for some reason or another, it's there. You, in 99.9% use cases, simply won't need it. Cache location. If you want to change the location of your cache to a folder that's not the standard, you're free to do so. I recommend just leaving it in the /cache folder. It just makes the most sense. And then you can click the update status. Now, expiry time and garbage collection. So what this will do is the cache will have, as it says, how long should cache pages remain fresh? That's 0 to disable garbage collection. A good starting point is 3600. The cache timeout is next scheduled garbage collection will be, I think that's 5 minutes. But what this will do is it will automatically check that your pages that have been expired are deleted from cache. Otherwise, what will happen is the files will continue to collect on the server. So if you have a large increasing amount of files in your cache folder, but you aren't adding a substantial amount of new pages, you will have to check to make sure garbage collection is working and that the plugin can delete the files in those folders. In most use cases, these default settings are fine. You can set it to do every 600 seconds to check for stale files. If you have a site that doesn't get updated very frequently, you could just set it to do it on a clock at once a day. Check at 23:00, so at 11 o'clock every day, it will go ahead and check for stale cache files to be deleted. And you can even email you when the garbage collection is run. You just don't need to know that information. The other thing you can do is up here is how long should cache pages remain fresh? Set 0 to disable the garbage collection, and a good starting point is 3600 seconds. I recommend this option is increased a lot more. If this is in seconds, you're probably going to want 6,000, so about 10 hours. Should the cache pages remain cached? So 60 seconds. Sorry, it should be more like, not 3,600. That's, my math just went out the window. It's going to be 36,000 seconds. What's going to happen is every 36,000 seconds, which should be every 10 hours, the cache will time out, it will expire, and then at 11 p.m., garbage collection will run with these settings and clear out the cached pages. The primary thing you want to do is make sure that your garbage collection interval is sufficient for what you need it, because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to have a large collection of files. The expired file is just going to keep collecting, and at this interval the cache is going to expire twice per day, every 10 hours. I'm only running garbage collection with this interval once daily. What would be a better option is do it half this time, so 1,000 seconds, and the interval won't matter because we're not doing a clock. At every 18,000 seconds, so instead of every 10 hours, every 5 hours, we're going to be running a check to make sure expired pages are cleaned out. This would be ideal. Garbage collection. Set the expiry time to 0 seconds to disable garbage collection. We're not going to do that. Accepted file names and rejected URLs. If for some reason you have a page or post type that's in here that should not be cached, you can disable it from being cached here. Normally, if it's a publicly accessible post type, then you'll want it to be cached. If you have a post type that's appearing in here though, for instance feeds, and you don't want them to be published, or cached rather, you're going to go ahead and disable it here. So that way they will not be cached. Sometimes when you cache feeds, you will get some unintended consequences. The feeds will not render correctly, and some other issues can occur. And you typically won't need to change any of these options unless you have a very niche user experience error that you're trying to resolve. Lockdown disabled. Prepare your server for an expected spike in traffic. When this is enabled, new comments on a post will not refresh the cached static files. Essentially, this is only useful if you have comments enabled on the website and it's not from a third party like Discus. What this will do is when your site is getting, say you're getting published in a very large editorial website and you're expecting a large increase in traffic, this will stop the cached pages from being purged when a comment is made. If you have a very popular piece, you will receive a lot of comments. Caching the page and just constantly recaching it and deleting it because new comments are being submitted is really slow and hammers the server. This option will not force the cache to be cleared when new comments, which has one intended consequence. Because you're telling the page cache to not be purged, users will continue to not see those comments. So new comments will not purge the cache, so users will not see those new comments and will not be able to interact. Depending on how your site's set up, you may very well want this. If you're on a smaller host and they're not really built to handle this kind of traffic, by all means enable that option. We're going to hop into the CDN section, but we're going to talk about it very briefly. Jetpack CDN, this is just basically an advertisement for Jetpack to go ahead and use. It was not found on your server, you can install it. If you have a CDN, a pull CDN, which has origin pull, which is most CDNs now, a push CDN is where you actually push your content onto the CDN's edge. This is a very simple, most CDNs act like this, they're just a proxy. So as it mentions, you basically put in the offsite URL, you put your site URL here, because oftentimes if you're only wanting to cache images, you may have your images on images.staging2.certmedia.com. The offsite URL then would be cdn.images.staging2.sertmedia.com. You don't need to play with these options too much because they work. It's a simple rewrite and then the page gets cached, so it doesn't really have much impact. Including directories, WP content covers every subfolder, so this is a good thing to have, along with WP includes. Include if the substring is included as PHP. If certain file types cannot be moved to your CDN or you're worried about bandwidth limitations, you can exclude them here. Sometimes font files will cause issues if pushed to the CDN, so you'll want to make sure that they're excluded here if you're experiencing those issues. If additional CNAMEs that you're including, you can enable them here. Essentially, all it will do is randomize it a bit. You shouldn't do this. Sharding as its own domain sharding is not a best practice anymore, and it can slow it down by the additional DNS lookups. So just go ahead and do the rest of these options. Ignore this. And then skip HTTPS URLs to avoid mixed content errors. You shouldn't need to enable this. Your site should be fully SSL compatible. So now we're going to go over to the last remaining pages. Contents, super simple section. It's only here for illustrating your cached pages. You can list them out. It'll tell you how many's cached, how many have expired. Not too much. Preload interval, as this section is basically the last real section. All this will do is it will preload pages into cache, so that way the first time someone sees it, it will be cached. So sometimes what will happen is on some caching plugins, they will not preload the cache. Cache Enabler is a good example. It only caches it after someone has visited the page once. The difference with Cache Enabler, though, is that it caches the pages for an unlimited amount of time unless you tell it otherwise. What this will do is it will go out of its way and preload your existing pages. Preloading will create a bunch of files. The good news, it starts by the newest pages and works its way back. So when you have a lot of posts, particularly in an editorial website, the newest ones, which are most likely to receive traffic, are going to be cached first. So if you have a shared host, this could cause you issues. It really shouldn't, though. In preload mode, regular garbage collection will be disabled so that old cache files are not deleted. This is recommended when the setting. So basically, you're going to want to go ahead and say refresh the preload pages every 600 minutes is a decent amount of time. That should be sufficient. You can enable preload for tags, categories, and taxonomies, which I do recommend. A lot of people underestimate the power of taxonomies and categories in particular. And these can be a major source of traffic, and they're good for your SEO when done correctly. Preload mode, garbage collection is disabled. You can, if you're going to enable this option, go ahead and enable the preload mode. It'll basically take care of it for you. The pages will be expired unless they're manually purged, and then the preload mode will automatically do the garbage collection for you. You don't have to worry about that. And then you can tell it to send you an email, say one at the start and one at the end of after all posts have been preloaded. If you have a lot of posts, oftentimes what will happen is your post will never all be fully cached unless you have an unlimited time set for your cache time. So you would set it to 0 to disable the expiry. Additional plugins is just them adding some form of compatibility. If you have a plugin like this, then by all means go ahead and enable it, like the Jetpack mobile theme. It'll automatically add the rules so that way the mobile site will function. And then the debug is simply to just help you debug errors. So there you have it, the complete guide to WP Supercache. If you have any questions about it, you can feel free to ask me below. If you have any specific use case issues, I recommend you contact me on my website, or you try to get support from Automatic on the WordPress.org forums. Thank you very much for watching.